Now let's join Maggie Linton on SiriusXM Urban View.
Well, welcome back. Later this hour, we'll talk with D.M. Jones, one of the founders of VONA, that's Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation, which has moved from Berkeley to Miami, and all the explanation about it. But we continue right now with advice and humor about moving on after divorce. Our guest is artist, athlete, mother, and author Ann Reichert. Her memoir, I loved it, folks. It is really good. The Dance Card, Looking for Love After Divorce. Welcome, Ann.
Hi, Maggie. Thank you for having me.
Listen, thank you so much for your flexibility today.
Yes, no problem.
Okay. Listen, let's talk about married, thinking you're going to be there for the rest of your life, and husband walks in and says,
he no longer loves me and wants to move on.
And
wants a divorce.
Exactly. and the reason he was leaving you is because he'd found somebody else.
You know what? I wasn't sure about that at that particular time, but obviously that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And really, that's not even the message. These things happen, and it's not an isolated event. Obviously, since my divorce 8 years ago, and I was 56 at the time. So, and you discover things down the road. But my real message in my book really has a lot to do with how we move forward.
Yeah.
I mean, I was married for 30 years, and as a couple for that length of time, you really define yourself as a couple, and then all of a sudden, at the age of 56, I was single, and where do you go? It's, I have a third of my life left. I really didn't want to be alone. Where does one go to find love again? Is that something that I really want? So those decisions are a lot of things that we have to wade through in terms of what we're looking for the last third of our life.
Yeah. And as you turned to some of your friends, you found out that some of them had done some struggles too, but also weren't that amazed that there might be a divorce.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like I said, it's just a fascinating phenomenon, and I think it's more typical than not, obviously. So there are so many of us out there, and so what do we do as far as moving forward? And what I found is, in order to be your true, authentic self, you have to define who you are, redefine who you are as me, a woman in midlife. All of a sudden, I'm single again, and I'm a significant individual, and I wanted to find someone again. But after 8 years of being divorced, actually, when I was first divorced at the age of 56, I started to think, well, where does one go to find love? And I challenged the notion of what it was going to be like to date in an online era.
Yeah.
And that means online dating and decision-making in regards to finding that right partner for a promising relationship through the online era really gave me a lot of romantic options, much more so than previous generations.
Yeah, and in finding the ability to believe in yourself, you learned a lot about yourself, didn't you?
Yes, I really did. And in many senses, it has been very empowering for me because before I sort of defined myself along with that individual that I was with, he was the first and foremost person in my life, and so what I did was centered around his whole life. Mm-hmm. I lost my identity, and I think that's very typical. So now I became a new individual, and it's really quite enlightening and powerful.
And you say you became a much more powerful individual. Your self-esteem went up dramatically during this time, too,
mm-hmm,
didn't it?
Mm-hmm. It did. And what I wanted to point out is that with any loss, there is a grieving process. And what I've discovered that everybody goes through that process in different stages, and it takes them different amounts of time. I was not familiar with where I was at in my grieving process, and what I had discovered was you have to go through all the stages in order to, lift that self-esteem to the point where you do become self-sufficient and important, and you feel good about yourself again. But I went into the dating scene as a
almost like a novice.
I was a novice,
Again,
and
yeah.
I was just newly separated, so I hadn't finished my grieving process.
Mm-hmm.
And it was wrong. It was the wrong time, and so I ended up, the first person that I met I had a relationship with, because I thought, well, this was perfect. And when in fact you discover down the road that it really isn't, because I wasn't selective enough. All I was thinking about was boosting my self-esteem and feeling good about myself again.
And the dance reference, because I'm telling you, there's some funny things in here. But even then, as you said, Dancing with the Stars, which is one of my favorite shows, may even be my absolute favorite show. There's a lot more thought about dance now, and So You Think You Can Dance. All of those different shows and when you look, America's Got Talent, there are people on there dancing all the time. Dancing has come back into our lexicon.
It has, and I really use dance as a metaphor in my book, and the book is entitled The Dance Card. And what I found over my 8 years is that back in my day, we used to have dances at recreational centers where we had dance cards. And a lot of younger people can't identify with that, but that's what I'm describing. On a dance card, you had 10 dances, usually ballroom dances like waltz or cha-cha or rumba, and you would dance with a specific man or date in hopes that, you'd find some kind of connection. And those dance cards today are now replaced by profiles online.
Yeah.
And really, a profile is almost like a sales pitch. You're trying to sell yourself. We are all pouring ourselves out, our hearts and soul out onto this virtual page. And so in the book, I decided after, meeting these people that they all had different personalities, totally different personalities. And I thought to myself, my gosh, this guy reminds me of the dance, the cha-cha, or maybe the tango. And so I've given each one of them an alter ego name associated with a particular dance.
Yeah. You put your, once again, we are talking with artist, athlete, mother, and author Ann Reichert. Her memoir is The Dance Card, Looking for Love After Divorce. And it's just deciding to even stick yourself out on the dance floor is amazing. But when you put your profile in that you put out online and everything was in caps, there's a reaction there, too.
Oh, there was a reaction, isn't it? And I didn't realize that until too late. I would get responses like, oh, my gosh, you're so harsh. And it does come across as very cold and bold and harsh. But when I wrote it, I thought, this will catch attention, when in fact it was negative attention.
Yeah. Well, also, when you put a demographic range at 500 miles, I went, whoa. She's willing to drive for this one.
And it's another point I need to point out, because I did discover that I dated several gentlemen that lived maybe 100 miles away, or they weren't within my driving range that would have been reasonable. And those relationships do not work.
Yeah, unless somebody's willing to move.
Unless somebody is willing to move, and that has not been the case with most of them. And the 10 particular dances I have on my card, and it's been 8 years, none of them, except for one. My very first entree onto the dance floor was Mr. Slow Dance, and he's the first one I had a 2-year relationship with, but he wanted to get married right away. He is the only one that is married. Every other one of these gentlemen are still single.
Yeah. The other thing you point out, though, is that the men, sometimes they're going through recovery, too, and they're not completely honest even with themselves.
They are not honest with themselves, Maggie. It's very sad. I mean, they're human, just like women. And as I pointed out, the grieving process is a process, and there is denial and shock and disbelief and anger and sadness, and they're all experiencing the same thing. But surprisingly enough, those men that were divorced, and let's say their wives left them, which is kind of typical today, believe it or not, they have such strong egos, and they carry the wounds from that hurt and pain of the divorce and the loss to such a degree that it's very hard for them to move forward with any new relationship at all.
Yeah, and them looking for literally a total replacement, not like knee replacement, but definitely, and taking the time to reevaluate themselves too, and you realizing what you wanted out of this next relationship, and whether you wanted it long-term, short-term, whatever.
I don't think any of us really go in knowing what we want, because it's all so new to us. And that's what I'm figuring out right now is we muddle through the online dating or any dating for that matter. And I haven't really ever been set up by a friend, or a blind date or anything like that. So the online dating scene has been the only way that I have been able to meet men. And initially I thought, well, maybe I wanted to get married again, and I don't rule that out. However, I don't think that there are many people out there in midlife. I'm just speaking of middle-aged people. That really want to have a long-term relationship. So what we are finding is that I've met a lot of gentlemen for companionship, friendship, and we still continue conversations today. Say, for example, Mr. Cha-Cha, who was one gentleman that I've really never met, but we've had an ongoing communication for 6 years, just via email or talking on the phone. And the reason we haven't met, curiously enough, is because, throughout our conversations, I found out that he had a stroke, and he had a lot of depressive bouts and was almost a recluse in his home and just could not get out of the house or even attempt to think about meeting someone. Yeah. But what we've done for each other is provided a different kind of relationship, which is kind of nice.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because over the years I've had, because of my work, I've had friends that I've talked to, and I call them friends because that's what it feels like, and that's what it is, that I've never met.
Yes. Isn't that curious?
Yeah.
That is so curious, and maybe it's a safe way of having not an intimate relationship, but it is kind of an intimate relationship in a different sense.
Yeah, and we check in with each other, but
yes.
I'm a caller, and so, a lot more calls than emails. I figure if I can say a lot more in a couple of minutes on the phone, and they'll actually hear my intonation and thoughts about it than me sitting down doing an email. Because emails can so quickly be misinterpreted, capital letters, lady.
Okay, and that's another thing I need to point out. You're right, Maggie. With online dating, the challenges are many because of technology. There is a detached communication, and there may be long periods of no communication at all with a person because of texting. It's a safe way of having a relationship, yet not having the commitment. And, texting is the popular way of communicating today. I'm sorry, but that's just the way people work. And unfortunately, it creates a miscommunication, and it's a form of meaningless connecting, which allows for non-commitment.
Right. Well, I'm okay with texting, but I'm not thrilled with it, and I'll just say that very, very quickly and very easily. Call me. We can get it done.
I have done that to a lot of my dancers, and they have a hard time calling.
Yeah, very true. All right, let's talk about a few of the guys.
Okay.
And one of the guys I want to talk about immediately is that you need to be wary of is Mr. Tango.
Mr. Tango, my narcissistic dancer. Here was a gentleman that I thought would be fit just perfect with me in my life because he presented all the wonderful characteristics that I was looking for in a man. Tall. Funny, that's one of my prerequisites. It sounds bizarre, but I wanted someone tall because I'm a tall woman. And, there's a psychological thing that goes along with that, I'm sure, but he was handsome, he was athletic, he was very intelligent, and so we met, but it was all about him. He never even inquired anything about who I was, nor did he care, but I kept going back to this guy because I thought, well, there's got to be something here. Maybe he will impart or show some interest at some point. But it ended up where he really didn't. He led the relationship. He called all the moves. He was embittered because his wife had left him for another man, and his ego just didn't leave room for me or my needs at all.
I had a gentleman on yesterday who was talking about how his daughter should find the right person, and one of the things he talked about is be wary of selfish men. And men who demand the me, have you seen me, have you done, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and be wary of them.
Well, you have to be wary.
No matter how tall they are.
Oh,
6'6".
yeah, no matter how tall they are. They're it's the selfishness that comes to the fore, and that never changes. It really doesn't. But in my particular dates with this guy, finally, and I had, I set out thinking I'm going to let him talk about himself. I wanted to show interest in him, and just curious to see if he would ever, ask me any questions, and he never did.
I was going to say he never stopped talking about himself.
He never stopped talking, but finally I had it. I think we were at a dinner. It was like a 2-3 hour dinner, and he was just going on and on, and I said, would you like to hear anything about my life? I just had to do that, and he matter-of-factly said, I don't know if I'm that interested.
There
and
you
I
go.
said, okay, well, I actually went ahead and I told him about myself.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think he was listening, nor did he care, but that was the end of that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and made sure he paid for the dinner. Once again.
Yeah, exactly.
Once again, we're talking with Ann Reichert. Her book, again, there's a lot of humor in it, but also a lot of common sense. It is The Dance Card, Looking for Love After Divorce. And, of course, it's available at Amazon.com and other locations. But we're going to continue to talk about the new way of dating, because a lot of women really find themselves out there, and men too, because of circumstances one way or the other. And you mentioned the slow dance, which I like you said, he's just was slow and patient and wanted to take his time, but he was ready to get married.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, he was my very first person that I met online, and like I said, he would be considered a rebound relationship. I needed someone at that time, and we provided for each other what we needed. But he was very slow, very conservative dancer, very uneducated, and that was one of my prerequisites. That's why it's very important to be selective and know who you are as a person and what you're looking for in an individual. Because after 2 years, I figured, oh my gosh, we can't even communicate because this guy doesn't have anything to say to me.
He was overwhelmed by the relationship just starting out the gate. Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Let's talk about the country western two-step.
Mr. Two-Step, he was a man that was enormous. He was actually only in his 40s, and I really didn't know that. But I was 56, and we had a one-time, I think it was a dinner, and I waited for him. He always had some excuses why he was late. But, I'm a patient person, and he showed up, and he was like 6'6", 350 pounds. And you'd never expect this guy to be an intellectual. He was almost like he was autistic. He had Asperger's. He was so bright. He had so many PhDs as a young man. He worked and spoke at various universities and lived a high life. He was into speedboats and racing cars, and then he decided that he needed to slow down in his life. I mean, everybody has a story, but his was kind of cute. And so he returned to the farm life, and he'd go to his grandmother's house in northern Wisconsin and ride tractors instead of speed cars and bring his horses and such. But our date was interesting because I think he felt almost insecure about being with a woman. It was like he didn't have the social norms to carry on a conversation. He was so bright, but he just didn't have the social norms. And that was just a one-time date. And, he was a lovely man, and that's where that one ended.
More than a couple of your dates turned out to be just kind of one-timers.
Yes.
Because by the time you really got out, and I'll call it to the dance floor, you really were secure in your own self. Not when you first started out, but by the time you moved on, you knew how you were. So you had parameters that people really had to meet.
Well, we do have to have those parameters, and even with all the parameters that we have, or supposedly we think we have, they don't generally match up to the reality of what it ends up being, unfortunately. I mean, I'm thinking this is a specific kind of person that I'm looking for, and they may have all of those attributes, but there is no perfection by any means. So we have to be able to be realistic in what we are looking for in a person, if in fact we want someone for long term. And I didn't really know what I wanted. So, and I still don't, to be honest with you. I have a lot of wonderful friends and friendships, but what I'm discovering is that I don't know, after this length of time, I'm kind of comfortable in my own single world, and if people can come, we can join together and maybe go to movies or just have connections that way. It's fine for now, but there is a loneliness that goes along with being by yourself. It is a couple society, unfortunately. And I shouldn't say unfortunately, but for those of us that are thrown into the single world, it changes the dynamics and our life completely.
But you, like you just said, though, you learn to be comfortable with you.
I have.
And you no longer know that, you know now that you don't need a man to complete your life, but he can definitely be part of your life.
Precisely. And that's the more, as these years go on, this is what I'm discovering more and more about all of us in midlife. We've had our families. We have our memories. We have our history. To start again is very difficult. And, that along with that comes blended families. And then, my girls are going to be getting married, and they'll be having their own children. And this is just a continuum. So we are evolving as we go. And if they have children, I'm going to be a grandmother, so that will be consuming my life. Do I want someone else's life and their children and grandchildren to consume mine, and to take away from what I have within my own family? I know that may sound selfish, but we have to decide that for ourselves.
I have to tell you, I loved how you included conversations, because so much of it, like you said, was done by email, so you do have copies of it. But Mr. Cha-Cha.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Come, go.
I know, and that's the man that had a stroke, and we still have conversations. But I think the emails or the actual conversations were very important to put in, so people really get an idea. Well, this is kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now let me talk about Mr. Rumba.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, this is a whole different light in terms of being a middle-aged woman, and all of a sudden being thrown into this scene of intimacy. We had an instant chemical connection, and that just was something that I was so shocked about, because, I thought, well, you have to gradually get to know someone. But no, we met online, and our conversations were so intimate and electrifying. The electrifying chemistry that we each had for one another was just undeniable. And when we did meet, it just,
it manifested.
It did.
Yeah.
It did, and it still does to this day, even through cyberspace.
Well, hey, nowadays online can bring you just about everything.
It can. But the curious thing about him, and we met quite a few times. We had quite a few dates, and we still have this wonderful connection. I don't know if it's just a sexual connection or not, and I'm being frank about that, but it probably is. He doesn't live in my city, so we don't see each other that often. But as with technology, he texts me, and he'll be saying, I'm thinking about you, I want to get together, and so it's fascinating. Fascinating.
He gives you that nudge when you need it.
It does. It's the nudge.
But I over the years, I'm married now, but every now and then you meet someone that the chemistry is just right. And, nowadays it may be a friendship. In fact, it is a friendship, but there are just people that just come in, capture, and boom, you're there.
It is, and it's definitely a biochemical thing, and it has to do with our dopamine in our brain, and for whatever reason we have the pheromones, they're called, that really attract us to certain individuals, and then there are others that just, there's no way. I mean, I knew instantly. I could tell instantly if I was going to have a connection with that person. But now, the chemical connection is just a small part of it. It is important, but you have to be able to have commonality on other levels. That is even more important, and that's the problem with people that go into relationships too soon. They are caught up into that passionate phase where, like I say, it's actually a 12 to 8 month phase where the brain has this dopamine phase, and all of it's almost like, how do I describe it? It's like a drug. But then after a while, that drug wears off, and then the companionate stage comes to the fore, and that's when, you don't really need all that intimacy. You still need the intimacy, but it's not a priority. Being a companion and to cohabitate and discover different aspects about that individual becomes much more important. That's why it is important to be selective in the beginning as to who you might want to end up with.
All right. I'm going to leave it at that, Ann. Okay. Listen, thank you so much for a very entertaining book, and I kind of call it a memoir, but it's also a teaching manual, too.
Oh, thank you.
And we could learn to love to dance. Once again, it is artist, athlete, mother, and author Ann Reichert. Her memoir, The Dance Card, Looking for Love After Divorce, is available at Amazon.com and other locations. More at her website, Ann Reichert. And I'll spell her last name. It is REICHARDT, AnnReichert.com. And she tweets too, Ann Schlicht, SCHLICHT. So go check her out and go dance, folks. Thank you, Ann. Continued happiness and success.
Thank you, Maggie.
All right. When we return, encouraging creativity for all. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Stories that inspire you. You are listening to The Maggie Linton Show on Sirius XM Urban View.